conflict, strife, altercation, fight, competition, disharmony. Why are you cheering for that? But okay. Clash, dissent, confrontation, hostility, animosity, war. Okay, did you know that in the English language that there are over 100 synonyms, or that's a way of saying there's 100 different ways to say the word conflict? Right? No, seriously, I can keep going here. Ready? Dispute, contention, combat, struggle, opposition, disagreement, animosity. Wait, I'm pretty sure I said one of those already. I already said animosity. That's fine. It deserved a second time. Okay, what's that? You guys want to hear some old-timey words for conflict? All right, here we go. I can do that. Fisticuffs, scuffle, fracas, feud, tumult. Okay, guys, for real. This literally does not stop. Here we go. Rumble, skirmish, clash. Ooh, what about a dust-up? Or a brouhaha. That's a word. A brouhaha, right? Okay. Seriously, there are so many words for conflict, like over 100 in the English language, right? The fact that we have so many words to describe conflict it shows just how much of a significant role that conflict actually plays in our lives, right? And depending on what you're experiencing at any given time, there can be days where you feel like conflict is just inescapable. And so over the past few weeks in our series called Fighting Fair, we've been talking about conflict and how to resolve it in healthy, respectful ways. In our first week, we talked about God repairing our broken relationship with Him, which then allows us to repair broken relationships with other people. And last week, we learned that Jesus' death and resurrection gives us peace with God, which hopefully should lead us to strive to have peace with others. We also we talked a lot about what it looks like to own and take responsibility for our own share of the conflict, right? Our own share of the conflict that exists in our relationships, taking ownership of that. And if you were here for either of those weeks, my hope is that you guys have actually taken to heart some of this, taken advantage, the opportunity to take steps towards reconciliation and peace in your own relationships. Some of them that have been strained or maybe broken, that you've taken some steps. But now this is where it gets deep, okay? What do we do when the conflict we experience is really not our fault? Or more specifically, what should we do when it is someone else's fault? Punch him. No, don't punch him. That's a bad option, okay? No. What if the person, how about this? What if the person that we're having conflict with is also someone who follows Jesus? Right? To answer these questions, I want to look at one of the few times that Jesus actually, he lays out a step-by-step for us. He gives us a plan of how to handle conflict when it's between two people who are both Christians, who are both believers. So let's take a look at Matthew 18, starting in verse 15. Later on, I think it's verse 19, you get that famous part where it talks about where two or more are gathered, three or more are gathered, I am there. And some people attribute that to worship, but it's actually talking about conflict. It's actually talking about when there's three or more people gathered, I'm there, I'll help you. Here we go. Matthew 18, starting in verse 15. If another believer sins against you, go privately and point out the offense. If the other person listens and confesses it, you have won that person back. But if you are unsuccessful, take one or two others with you and go back again, so that everything you say may be confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses. If the person still refuses to listen, take your case to the church. Then if he or she won't accept the church's decisions, treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. Okay, those first 3 words are so important to understanding these verses here. Jesus is specifically talking about how we should respond when we find ourselves in conflict with another believer. right? This is not someone that doesn't believe in God. This is talking about another believer. To be clear, there's going to be some principles that'll probably apply to all relationships, but if we're going to let the Bible actually speak to us, we need to understand the audience that this part was actually intended for. So with that in mind, let's actually take a look at some of the steps that Jesus laid out for us. Here's the first one. Go to the person privately. This is a really important first step. Remember how last week we talked about how with some conflict, the other person might not even know that there is conflict. They might not even know that they've done something to offend you. Going to the person privately gives them an opportunity to realize that they've offended you. And hopefully they can apologize and change their behavior. Sure, it's probably going to be an awkward conversation. But if they're willing to hear you out, the end result is hopefully reconciliation and peace, just like we've talked about the last 2 weeks. But if that does not work, step 2, take 1 or 2 others with you and try again. The goal here is to recognize that simply continuing to argue with the person who offended you isn't going to solve anything. If you decide to bring 1 or 2 other people with you, here's a really important thing, okay? If it doesn't work, you've approached that person, you've tried to figure it out, but it's not receptive and you still need to talk to them, and you decide to bring 1 or 2 other people, I suggest bringing people that are somewhat objective. Okay, by objective, I don't mean like bringing people that are automatically just going to take your side. Instead, you want to bring someone that you think the other person is also going to respect and hopefully listen to. An added benefit to bringing 1 or 2 other people is that they might be able to help you see things from the other person's perspective too. And hopefully, the second conversation will cause the other person to maybe realize that they've offended you, apologize, and change their behavior. But if that still doesn't work, Jesus has got a third step for us. Take your case to the church. All right, this one here is a little bit confusing because churches kind of worked a little bit differently back then. You see, back in the New Testament, what would happen is the local synagogue functioned almost like a court, right? Like someone there making the decisions, and that was in the church, in the synagogue. So if something small happened, like your neighbors kicked a soccer ball through your window, except they didn't have windows and they didn't have soccer, you get the point there. If they did something minor like that, you'd take your case to the local synagogue where they would decide who is right and who is wrong. Today, churches don't really function like that, right? Like, you know, if I stole one of Ashley's rubber duckies and then she came up into the church and was like, Connor stole my rubber ducky in front of the whole church. They don't really do that these days, right? That's not how that works. Right? You don't state your case on a Sunday morning. I think it makes more sense, though, to involve local church leaders, right? Trusted leaders from the church. For example, you might ask your life group leader, or me, or both of us to sit in on a conversation. The goal isn't that we would be judge and jury. Instead, having church leaders present is another way to help make sure that everyone's able to be heard and that the conversation actually stays civil. And hopefully, this third conversation will cause the other person to realize that they've offended you, hopefully apologize, and change their behavior. But if that still does not work, Jesus is like, option 4, but you got to do all these other options first. You can't just skip to the end. That's not how this works. Option 4, move on, but keep your distance. Jesus says that if the other person still refuses to listen, you should treat that person as a pagan or a corrupt tax collector. And that basically means from that point forward, you might be better off if you just decided to keep your distance from that person for a little while. At this point, you also got a decision to make here. If you've reached step 4, you have a decision to make. Are you going to let go and move on, or are you going to harbor resentment in your heart? And honestly, that part is entirely up to you. But speaking from my own experience, nothing good comes from holding on to your anger. Nothing good comes from holding on to your anger, especially when someone's offended you. Moving on isn't easy, But that's also why Jesus made a point to say that you should bring others with you in steps 2 and 3. If things still don't work out and you get to step 4, those people that you had helping you can be an incredible source of encouragement when you're feeling angry and defeated. So now that we've kind of tackled those steps that Jesus laid out for us in the Bible, is there anything else we need to learn from this passage? And I think there is. I think there's a few key ideas that I want to make sure that we don't miss from what Jesus is saying. First is this: God's heart is still about reconciliation, not revenge. Yes, this process that Jesus lays out may eventually lead you to deciding to just stay away from the other person, but that's not the goal. The motivation behind each step is to see the relationship restored and even hopefully stronger than it was before. Notice how Jesus doesn't talk about punishment. He doesn't talk about revenge in these verses. Kid kicks a soccer ball through the window. Okay, I'm going to dangle him over that cliff, right? Let's go. No, no. Tal. He never says to make someone pay for what they've done. He doesn't encourage us to take certain actions so the other person feels the consequences of what they've done. Everything he says points towards a specific goal, and that goal is for the relationship to be restored. Second idea that jumps out to me. Gossip. Gossip doesn't have a place in this process. Jesus tells us to start by keeping our conflict private. When someone sins against you and you can't let it go on your own, it's best to go straight to them and have a conversation about it. How many of us are guilty of not doing that, though? I don't know. I've been guilty of that. I want to be, before I continue, I want to be absolutely clear, like I was last week, right? Absolutely clear that Jesus is talking about conflict here, not abuse. There's a difference, right? If you're ever in a situation where someone makes you feel unsafe, you're being threatened, that's abuse. That's not conflict, right? I don't want you to feel like you have to confront that person on your own. Like I said last week, there's a lot that you can do to help you resolve a conflict. But when the conflict includes threats of harm, I want you guys to know that you can always talk to me. You can talk to your life group leaders or any adult in this room, right? No matter what, we really want to make sure that you guys are safe. Okay, but assuming that we are talking about conflict and not abuse, talking about it with a bunch of other people before you talk to the person who offended you, it's going to make it worse. I'm just going to be blunt there. It makes it worse, like 100 times. Even if the conflict gets to like step 2 and step 3, the goal of bringing other people into the conversation isn't just so you can have more people on your side, just so you have more people to believe you and get mad at the other person. The goal is for those people to help you actually resolve the conflict. And here's another step here, third one. Everyone involved is still in the same team. Remember how I said at the start, Jesus is specifically talking about other believers, right? So these are other Christians that we're dealing with in conflict. Even if someone does something to offend you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are automatically a bad person, and it doesn't automatically mean that they are a bad Christian. I've seen this so many times that sometimes there's a miscommunication, or another person just doesn't see things the way that you see them. They see them differently. In some cases, seeing things differently is actually a good thing. It's actually okay. Jesus actually never said that we have to agree on everything as Christians. But check out what he says in John 13, verse 34 to 35. So now I'm giving you a new commandment: love each other, just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. It doesn't say your similar belief in all things will prove that you are a disciple. It says that your love for one another. We don't always have to agree, but we do need to love each other. And one of the best ways to remember that is that we're all on the same team. Everyone who believes in God is trying to figure out what it means to trust and follow Jesus. And of course, we're not all at the same point in that journey, right? Some of us have been here for a long time, and maybe some of us are just starting out. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we're all trying to accomplish the same thing. And even when we disagree, we're still better together than we are apart. So besides following the steps that Jesus gave us, what should you do if you suddenly find yourself in conflict with someone else who also believes in Jesus? Here are my final steps before we go to life group to help you in the process. First is this: be ready to forgive. When we confront someone who's offended us, our goal should be for our hearts to align with Jesus' heart. This means that we should see the conversation as an opportunity to seek reconciliation. But it's impossible to find reconciliation if we're not first willing to forgive that person who has offended us. As you consider whether or not you want to confront the other person, it's important to resist approaching that conversation with a desire to win, just like I want to talk to that person so that I can win or be right. The goal is reconciliation, not shame or revenge. But that's not always easy. That's easier said than done. So it's actually okay if you need to take some time before having the conversation. Especially when it comes to like minor offenses. I'd argue that if you're not ready to forgive the person, you're not ready to confront them either. Confronting them before you're ready to forgive them is more like just wanting to pick a fight than it is in actually seeking reconciliation. Second step you can take is this: choose your words carefully. The Bible has a lot to say about our words, a lot to say about our tongues. And Jesus' process for confronting another believer who's wronged you is extremely helpful, but it doesn't mean that it's easy or simple. In fact, even if we follow the plan step by step and we go through and we check it off, there's still so many ways that things can go wrong. So many ways. Someone can explode at you still. And you'll be like, how do I deal with this? Even when done with the best of intentions, confronting someone who has wronged or offended you can easily be interpreted as an attack. How much do you guys like when someone tries to tell you that you've done something wrong? It doesn't feel good. I'm sure you don't love it. It sucks, right? Even when done with the best of intentions, it can feel like an attack. And that's why it's so important to choose your words carefully. Honestly, I recommend like planning ahead. Planning ahead by writing down exactly what you want to say. Maybe have a few minutes and you can like practice in front of a mirror a few times. As you plan your words, remember that God's heart is all about reconciliation. And the words that you use are going to either help you move closer or farther from that goal. So during this time, I'd also encourage you to spend some time praying, asking God whether or not the words you've written are what He would want you to say. In the book of Psalms, David has like a beautiful way of laying this out for us here. He kind of gives us what this prayer might actually sound like. This is what he says: "May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord my God, my rock, my redeemer." Once you figured out what exactly you want to say to that person, the third step you can take is this, the final. Be direct, but also be kind. And this is probably the most difficult part of this conversation. On the one hand, you want to be super clear about how the other person's words, their actions, or both have affected you. But on the other hand, you also don't want to escalate the conflict unnecessarily, and that's why you got to try to find this balance between being direct and being kind. Here's a few ways that you can still be kind even though you're confronting the other person about something they did to hurt or offend you. Get straight to the point. Start by telling them that, hey, I got to have a conversation with you that may be difficult for both of us, but I'm hoping to put this difficulty behind us, right? I want to talk about something that's going to be hard for us, but I want to put this difficulty behind us. This helps like set the tone for the conversation and keeps the other person from having to guess why you want to talk to them. Okay, how about this? Don't yell. Yeah, it is, right? But get this. Even if you're still angry about what the other person did or said, yelling tends to make everyone involved get defensive. Think about maybe a time that a friend or a sibling or a parent has yelled at you and you just immediately like tune out. You like shut off. Like they're yelling at me, like I'm not listening. I'm not here anymore, right? So if you want to figure things out and fix things in a relationship and you start yelling, they're tuned out. They're checked out, right? They get defensive. When you get defensive, you stop listening. When you're confronting someone, it's always a good idea for you to speak with them with the same tone and volume that you hope that they're going to use to respond with you. And then finally, just give them a chance to respond. Assuming that you've actually made it this far in this conversation, because this might not happen every time, but you've made it to this point, one last way to show them kindness is to give the other person the opportunity to respond or even ask questions. Remember, there's a possibility that they might not have even known about the conflict to begin with, that you were upset. So it's definitely okay if they need a little bit of time before they respond. Guys, confrontation isn't easy. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable. Sometimes it's even scary, right? But it's also necessary if we want to build and maintain healthy relationships. Thankfully, the blueprint that Jesus gave us here in Matthew, as we just read, that blueprint that he gave us gives us a great place to start and a clear path to move forward on reconciliation with other believers. I know that there's probably some of you that need to have a conversation like this with someone soon. And if that's the case, I want you to know that I'm praying for you. I'm rooting for you. And I'd be open to helping you in any way that I can, right? Please don't hesitate to ask me, one of the other adults. But also, think about it this way. We've had this conversation, and maybe there's someone that needs to approach you with a conversation. How are you going to respond? Based on what we've learned these last few weeks, how would you respond if someone says, hey, like, I need to have a conversation with you about just something tough? How are you going to be willing to respond and restore that relationship? Let's pray before we go into life groups. God of grace, thanks so much for this day. Thank you for these students. And I just pray that if there's conversations that need to be had, that they would do that with much kindness. Even if they are direct, God, that they would do it in kindness. Lord, I just pray over the life groups that are going to be meeting. Would they be fruitful? And would they continue to grow with one another in those groups? I pray for the leaders that aren't here, either due to sickness or other reasons, God, that you would be with them and you'd be healing them. You are the Prince of Peace, God, King of Kings. We give you all the praise and glory today. In Jesus' name, amen.